Thank you very much, Colin. And right, fine, 20 minutes. Yes, I was lying to Colin when I told him what the subject of my paper was going to be, because I looked at the title and it's much too long and boring. So, in fact, what I'm really going to talk about is, do the regulations and guidelines help? Which is kind of the same thing, really, because it depends very much on the differences between standards, regulations, and requirements. The requirements being what we're trying to achieve, the standards and regulations being the way in which we hope it's going to be achieved. And all of the examples that I'm quoting are going to come from a small, obscure island where there are very, very few good acousticians left in England at the moment, because they're all in this room. Okay, this is the argument that started in 2003 when we started talking about building Bulletin 93, which is what we call our standard, our guidance, whatever you wanted to call it, for acoustics in schools. It's very simply that the moment you produce a building regulation and then a standard which says schools have to have these numbers associated with them, reverberation time, internal sound insulation, noise levels, and so on, once those numbers are in a standard, they become the number that's always applied. But if they're part of a regulation, then it can't be a very good number. You cannot have above average acoustics in all of your schools. You can't regulate for that. So it has to be a bad number. It has to be the absolute minimum that you can design to. And therefore, we all end up designing to a minimum standard. They also get applied to the wrong kind of buildings, and I'll give some examples of that later. And also, I think, most importantly, in very many cases, people just apply them without thinking about them. Before we had standards, if we were doing a school, I would actually sit down with my staff and say, OK, here, a primary school, what standard should we design it to? Now, it just gets done. All these numbers get written down. I don't think it's necessarily right. But the counter-argument to all of this is that if we don't have regulations, then there's no incentive at all for anyone to design to good acoustics. Well, there is for acousticians, for acoustics consultants, because we believe schools should have good acoustics, and also we get paid for doing it, sometimes. The other counter-argument is very simply, well, think about what things were like before we had regulations. In fact, we've always had guidelines since 1953, I think, in the UK, but they've never been enforced. The difference in what's happened since 2003 in England and Wales, anyway, it's not even part of this, all of this island. It's only a little part of the island, England and Wales. We let the Scots and the Irish get on with themselves. But before 2003, there was a design note, there were some standards, there was absolutely no way whatsoever of enforcing them, and I actually worked as an acoustic consultant for 12 years before actually realizing that this document with the guidelines on school acoustics existed. Before 2003, people were still churning out schools like this, and this is a very famous school by a very famous architect. He's less famous now than he was because he's been dead for some time. But it's called the Smithson School, and it was designed by Henry Smithson, an architect, and it's kind of brutalist architecture. This isn't the sports hall, this is the main assembly hall. It's a bit more colourful than that now. And it was an open plan school. Everything happened in here. I was brought into this school just over 10 years ago to give them some advice, and we talked about putting a lot of partitions in and a lot of acoustic absorption and some other minor changes, such as arranging the access to the classrooms so that they had doors. And then we were told we weren't going to be allowed to do it because it was a listed building for conservation purposes, historic building. It's a school. I mean, who needs to hear what's going on in a school? So it's very helpful that now we have regulations saying things like this. And the important thing about the regulations is that this states the intention, what we're setting out to do. It doesn't state numbers. It says each room or other space in a school building, blah, 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 has the acoustic conditions appropriate to its intended use. In other words, it has to be fit for purpose. That's hardly a surprising statement, but it's the first time it has actually been stated as a regulation. And then the regulation has to go forward and talk about, well, what the numbers are. and this is where things get complicated. And it says here, in the Secretary of State's view, that is effectively the Minister of Education's view, basically go and read Acoustic Design of Schools, Building Built in 93, and that has all the numbers in it. The Secretary of State, by the way, doesn't actually know a great deal about acoustics. So my friend Richard Daniels and Andy Parkin and I spent quite a lot of time deciding what the Secretary of State's view should be. And the lovely thing is that we've had a lot of different Secretaries of States, but Building Built in 93 has remained roughly the same. So effectively, the standard then becomes the numbers. So yes, they have to set numerical criteria to show compliance with the regulations, but these are minimum standards. Does anyone here know the technical term catnip? There's a term in environmental control called BATNIC, which is best available technique not entailing excessive cost. In other words, what we can do to protect the environment for a given amount of money. Catnip is what we now have in acoustic standards, which is the cheapest available technology not involving prosecution. The least we can do. Very, very sadly, this is absolutely true, and the vast majority of my time when I'm designing schools is spent persuading contractors that they have to spend some money on acoustics. The other problem with standards is that by the time you've written a standard, it's out of date. It takes 5 years to write, even a straightforward set of guidelines like this. So we have guidelines as well, and the previous Building Built in 93 actually included, Chapter 1 had the numbers in it, Chapters 2 to 6 and all the appendices and so on had all the guidelines about how to achieve it, the useful, interesting stuff, examples and so on. I believe that later versions of Building Built in 93 just had Chapters 2 to 6 printed with blank pages because nobody ever read it. But the moment that you introduce guidelines, again, you're putting numbers in, somebody will point to them, some other person writing another set of regulations will refer to them, and all of a sudden, those numbers are ipso facto regulations. And then those regulations start being applied to buildings where it's stupid to apply the regulations. And one of them was this building. It's a set of teaching studios for a performing arts building for a school and sixth form college in Norwich. It was designed by a well-known firm of multidisciplinary consultants, including architects, engineers, and acousticians, who are not represented at this conference. And what they did, they took the minimum standards from Building Built in 93 and they applied them to these studios. These are effectively teaching studios, music rehearsal rooms. It's a 3-story building. There's a television studio downstairs, a broadcasting studio upstairs. These are all rock venues for teaching people how to record rock music. The big thing about that is that in one recording suite, you mustn't be able to hear what's going on in the next one. You can't tie that down to a number. You've got to know the relationship between the background noise, the internal sound insulation, what actually inaudible for music means. And we were dragged in to sort out the mess because effectively they built this and it was unusable. Another case in which you simply cannot apply numbers, of course, as Christian was saying earlier on, you can't standardize the design of theatres. Some schools in England is a very poor country. I mean, we all stand around saying we don't have any money to spend on schools, except in what we call public schools, which of course are really private schools, so I call them independent schools, where we actually have to pay fees to send children to them. They have a lot of money, and they tend to build this kind of building. This is rather a nice one at Hampton School. Again, the client came to us and said, we would like you to design this to Building Built in 93 for us. And we said, no, what we want to do is design you a good auditorium, not just the kind of least we can get away with. BB93 just sets reverberation times. But there are places where the regulations work, and in fact where they are absolutely essential. Again, you won't be able to read this because it's on a very small scale. This is a huge building. It's an old industrial building which is being converted to what we call university technical colleges, which really is English for really cheap school for teaching people to do things. But it's a school. It's part of the building regulations. And when it originally came to us to be designed, the architect said, this area in the middle here, we're going to have a couple of lecture theatres here and a couple of classrooms here. And I said, that's very nice. And what shall we do about the partitions going around the outside there and between them? And he said, partitions? Walls? No, we're going to delineate them. We're going to put tape on the floor. And so we talked a little bit about acoustic tape, and they nearly threw us off the job. I said, why do you want an acoustic consultant on this job if you're not going to design somewhere which is going to be fit for purpose? And he said, but the building regulations say we have to do it. And it's only because that building regulation existed that we ended up with something which is, this is far from ideal. It doesn't actually comply with a lot of the numbers in the regulations. There were a lot of kind of derogations thrown about, but it's a lot better than it would have been. We have classrooms around the outside with doors and walls and windows, and it's great. You can stand in one classroom and not really hear too much of what's going on next door. We have a management system, which means that this big area here is not being used for anything very noisy while these classrooms are in use. And also, we have in this area here, which this started out with a reverberation time that Trevor would have been quite interested in, about 5.5 seconds. We were allowed to put in a lot of acoustic absorption. I brought it down to just under 2 seconds, which still sounds horrible, but less horrible than it would have done. And Colin, you'll be pleased to recognise some of the enormously large quantity of acoustic absorbers in there. This is somewhere where the regulations very nearly worked. This is a very nice new state school built at enormous expense out of cross-laminated timber. And this central area here is really where everything happens. These are all classrooms coming off here. Big circulation areas. This is about 14 metres tall. It is, in fact, a more than 10-metre tall dining hall, but it's not for kindergarten. And those of you who could see down the corner here, that's retractable seating which goes into a lecture theatre with a folding partition, which is not big enough for the school, so they have their assemblies in here. They unfold the partition, and the headmaster talks, and nobody can hear what he's saying. The reason they can't hear what he's saying is because of the lack of acoustic absorption up here. And that is because when the acoustics consultant came on board in the first instance, she was told, yes, we've agreed an alternative standard for this room. It's allowed to have a reverberation time of 3.2 seconds. The building control officer who enforces the standards has agreed this. And I said, well, why 3.2? He said, well, that's what the acoustics consultant tells us it's going to be if we don't have any acoustic absorption in it. So we're trying to sort this out. But there are, again, places where it really does work. Special educational needs, autistic children, children with attention deficit disorder, children with either permanent or temporary hearing impairment. There's an awful lot of time and effort being spent on this now. This is a good example of how it's done. 3 things to notice. That girl there has actually got 2 cochlear implants. If you want to hear what the world sounds like to somebody with 2 cochlear implants, go onto our website, listen to some of the oralizations on there. It's terrifying. I don't know how they can cope with it. But cochlear implants, or any other type of hearing aid, means that you have to operate within a very narrow dynamic range. Children, in particular, with these, are very, very sensitive to loud noises. They also have very, very low signal-to-noise ratios that they can work to. So we have to keep the noise levels down. Now, fortunately, we have regulations, again, about special needs, and it's the Equality Act, which, of course, comes from the EU, which England would much rather not be in, I'm told. But we have to prepare and implement accessibility strategies to make our schools more accessible to people with special needs. And for special needs, read handicapped, really. Which means that we actually have an incentive, a financial incentive, to comply with these and design, for example, somewhere like these. These are profound multiple learning disability classrooms in a mainstream school in a very, very poor area of London, actually. Anyone who is attending the TABS seminar a little bit later on will be interested to know that this is a very large room. It's about 10 meters by 12. It accommodates 16 children at most, but normally they have 8 children in here. That is an exposed concrete soffit for thermal purposes. These are suspended rafts supplied by a well-known Swedish company, and this is acoustic absorption around the edge. And in terms of reverberation time, without getting technical, it works. Mid-frequency reverberation times around about 0.4 seconds. Furnished, it works very well. We could not have done that if the regulation hadn't been there to start with, to say, you, the contractor, who is being paid for building this school, have got to use up some of your profit margin by putting acoustic treatment in. And we also have, this is a shock to a lot of people in England, we also have guidance saying this: where pupils with special needs are taught in mainstream schools, the acoustics of the spaces where they're taught in have to be enhanced in the same standards to those in special schools, fair enough, but also they should be taught in smaller groups. Now, if anybody would like to come and discuss with me afterwards, but we've always done it this way in Sweden, Germany, India, wherever you're from, please do, because I would like to know why this is seen as such a radical step in England. I spend a lot of my time measuring noise levels in classrooms to associate or to assess for pupils and for their parents whether a given school is actually adequate for their child, normally their deaf children. And what we find is very, very simply that there is a correlation between the number of children in a classroom and the noise level in that classroom during any form of work. It takes an awful lot of measurements to do it. It's very, very low-tech measurements, and really what we do is we process all these measurements, shove them all on a graph, and see what kind of guidance, what kind of results we're getting. And it's fairly clear from a graph like this that, for example, the red dots are all in a mainstream classroom, average class size 27. The black dots are all in an independent school, average class size 15. And although there's quite a bit of overlap, you can see the trend. Big difference, about 10 dB. And one of my staff is currently putting together a database of all of these measurements that we've done. Here is a graph of noise levels during group work, okay, which is when children are sitting, writing, working supposedly quietly as a function of class size. And you know, the correlation is not great, but there is a clear, that's a best straight line fit through there, there's a clear dependence of background noise on pupil numbers. Therefore, the answer is, if you want low noise levels in classrooms so that you can teach pupils with hearing aids, then you've got to have small classes. Not surprising. So, conclusions. Yes, we still do need regulations. They're essential. If we don't have regulations, then a lot of schools will just go back to being built without any acoustic treatment whatsoever. Sad but true. We need to apply some intelligent thought to selecting and applying those standards and guidance. It's not good enough just to go through and deal with the numbers. A lot of my colleagues, I regret to say, not the ones in this room, will just apply those standards without thinking about them. They're not doing their job properly. But we still do need to carry on developing and applying these regulations and standards and understanding why we're doing it. Thank you very much. Thank you.